This is a production of Cornell University.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aishan Hutchinson, the current director of the graduate creative. Let's start again. Of the graduate creative writing program at Cornell. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final reading of the Spring 2023 Zalaznick reading series. This event is happening on the traditional homelands of the Gayakano, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakano are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakano, dispossession, and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakano people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Following these very brief housekeeping remarks, Aimee Bender will be introduced by Saul Wooten, a second-year graduate fiction student in the graduate writing program. But first, on the behalf of my colleagues in the writing program, I wish to extend my immense gratitude to our donors, Barbara and David Zalaznick, whose generosity and support continue to make this reading series a rich highlight of life on our campus each semester. The Zalaznicks aren't present this evening, but I'm asking you kindly to give them a loud round of applause, so wherever they are, they can hear it. Special thanks to Amanda Lynn Bruckner, our MFA graduate coordinator, and Emily Parsons, the office manager for the Literatures and English department, for working assiduously behind the scenes on every aspect of our reading series. I'll ask you kindly to give them a round of applause too. They're somewhere. Show of hands, those who have attended all of the readings this semester. Okay, those who haven't, give those who did a round of applause. And you're all welcome next year, next semester, to an exciting list of writers that we have for you. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones or silence them, put them on silence. You're invited after the reading for a reception upstairs in the literature lounge and to get your book signed there. Now, please join me in giving a hand to Saul, who will introduce Aimee. Saul?
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our final reader of the Spring 2023 Zalaznick reading series, Aimee Bender. Aimee Bender is the author of 6 books of fiction, including the New York Times notable book, The Color Master, and the New York Times bestseller, The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake. Her short fiction has been published in Granta, the Paris Review, Harper's, McSweeney's, and more, as well as heard on This American Life and Selected Shorts. Her books have been translated into 16 languages, and she teaches writing at USC. There's an energy to Aimee Bender's work that seems appropriate for spring in Ithaca, an attention to the existence of the startling possibility in the everyday. Her writing infuses old tales and myths with fresh energy. It transforms emotion that often exists beneath the surface into something that we can witness. I first heard of Aimee Bender in 2019 when someone who knew much more about contemporary fiction than I did praised The Girl in the Flammable Skirt. I scribbled the title down, promising myself that I would read it one day. Preparing for Aimee's visit to campus has reconnected me with the pleasure to be found in getting lost in another person's obsessions and language. In an interview in Fail Better, Aimee speaks of how she often thinks about the limits and possibilities of language, how it is our best tool in so many ways, and how limited it is, how we have to redo it all the time to try and get it right. Here, she skillfully articulates the paradox of writing, of attempting to capture what cannot be captured, and yet we still try and sometimes create some little miracle in the process. Aimee Bender has been called a master of the eccentric American short story by NPR and one of the finest humorists by the LA Times. The Washington Post has described her as acutely attuned to the poignant emotional distances between people. Professor Emily Fridland, who teaches here at Cornell and is a former student of Aimee's, spoke of what a generous and attentive reader Aimee is, always alert to the undercurrents and possibilities in students' writing. As I read and listened to Aimee's interviews, I realized how interconnected the act of writing and teaching can be. In response to a question about how she encourages her students to trust the unconscious, she said, quote, "When writers are enjoying what they're writing, even if it's painful enjoyment or painful material, the writing tends to be more interesting. So I try to use exercises to shake up the writers in a class, to get them out of their heads, away from their ambitions for stories, their conservatisms, and to have fun." End quote. As a new writer struggling to find my way through language, it's reassuring to be reminded that writing can and should be fun, even when it is difficult. Reading Aimee Bender's fiction, I feel the enjoyment of the writer as she makes discoveries and connections on the page, as the conscious and unconscious and the real and imaginary collide in fantastically vivid ways. Please join me in welcoming Aimee Bender.
Thank you so much, Sol, for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate it so much. Thank you, Aishin, for having me here. And Emily, so beautiful to see you. And thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time, and I appreciate you being here. So I'm going to read just like a tiny, teeny bit of The Butterfly Lampshade, and then a newer short story. But I wanted to just read a little bit from this. This is my most recent novel. And maybe it sort of connects to the act of giving a reading, but I'll explain more in a second. All you need to know here is that the character is moving from one household to another. She's 8, she's in a time of enormous stress, and she's being escorted by a sort of distant relative on a train from Portland, Oregon to Los Angeles. And this is just about a page and a half of them in the dining car together. And it's also about listening to someone read. I positioned myself on the side of the table that tracked the scenery gone by, and outside the big picture windows, golden light began to drench the landscape as the sun reached the edge of the horizon. Clinking silverware and jabbered conversation filled the train car. When our food arrived, the steward and I ate quietly as if my uncle had actually told him not to talk to me as I'd requested, and my mind filled with non-thoughts, with blocks of sensation, golden dusk, the sparkle on the water glass, crispy French fry smell, our chuggety movement down the edge of the land. After dessert, 2 silver bowls of ice cream, the sun slipping behind the hills, the steward pulled my babysitter's instruction paper from his jacket pocket and read what he could in the dimming pink light. "It says here your bedtime is 8:30, he said. It's 7:30 now." I turned from the window. His eyes were small and dark, the eyelids rough-looking, papery. His mouth, wide, thin, did look a little like my uncle's. He picked up one of the books. "Shall I read aloud?" It was a mustard yellow book, stained with multiple rings from drinks. "Whales," he said. "I've been reading this week about whales." I didn't respond, and he thought about it for a while and then thumbed to the middle somewhere, finding his bookmark. He did not return to the beginning of the book, but began to read in a quiet voice, a hushed voice that even the table next to us would not be able to hear, where he had left off. I leaned back on my side of the booth. I felt such a tiredness inside me. The butterfly and my thoughts about the butterfly were waiting for me to pour over once I was alone, but the rest of the world was like some kind of swirl, a minute-by-minute negotiation of swirl. My mother swirled inside all of it, and inside the swirl there were small things to hold on to, handrails to find, and the way he was reading was one of them. Quote, "The captain stood by the mast of the ship to peer at the shape in the distant water." End quote. Outside, the light of evening washed the palest of blues. The table next to us, 2 children and 2 parents sent a clatter of forks to the floor. "Shh, Evan, it's a restaurant." Even at 8 years old, there was something in the steward's way of reading that was significant to me. That at first, what I heard were words about whales unattached to any story or context, and therefore easy to listen to without any bait inside them. I did not have the energy to care about a book, and to start at the beginning might have felt a demand on my attention. To start where he had left off meant he would be fully engaged, and I could drift in and out as needed, could conserve everything else inside me to maintain the moment-by-moment human operation. This tiny choice he made, this delicate calibration of his position against mine, of our two-peopleness. The chapter was about a whale that had injured a fin and had been attended to by a series of divers off the coast of Australia. The blue outside intensified, and later, when I would think back on that moment, which I think about not infrequently, hearing his voice, imagining us rolling through the evening landscape, I can see the darkening shadows of trees and houses blurring into whale pods and divers and schools of darting fish. He read for a half hour or so as people moved in and out of the dining car, and I drifted in and out too, and then for the remaining time he waved off the waiter, and we just looked together out the window at the silhouetted shapes of the small trackside towns. All right, that was is this the one I opened? I think it's this one. No, it's not clear. Yeah, it was, yes, so whoever said yes, good observing. So I really enjoyed writing that passage, and I think part of the reason I wanted to read it at a reading, hopefully the story I read next will absolutely engage you and you will hang upon every word. But I had a friend once who said when he went to readings, he would also enjoy the space it gave him. It was a different mind space than just walking around or listening, that to hear someone reading gave his mind some freedom to move about. In case it drifted to different places than it might drift when you were doing whatever else you might be doing. And I think that might have been the kernel of that moment in the book, just that feeling of what is it like to be hearing something and be preoccupied, and both hearing and preoccupied. So I think maybe I just wanted to put that in place, even though, we'll see. We'll see how the story goes. This is a new story I have not read aloud before, and the kernel of this one is just, I was jealous of people who were writing stories about psychics, so I wanted to write one. And it's called Nights with Art Bell. For a couple of months in my mid-20s, I believed myself to be psychic. I was mostly wrong, but right twice, and those 2 times so declaratively right that I found myself microscoping in those days all my feelings and thoughts, my senses, digging around to see if they also supplied potent clues about the future. It was a great relief when enough time had passed without incident and I could think and feel whatever I wanted without worrying I was predicting anything at all. I could then imagine the previous times as part of a phase, a moment of connection to a larger reality that I had passed through in favor of ordinariness. Until I hit 40, and on the day of my birthday saw a premonition of a balloon on our lawn. A huge blue balloon collapsed with a broken body in it and had the same extra vibrant quality of my previous visions, leading me to panic. Who was the broken man? Why a balloon? My husband, a Jungian therapist, said it might be about my uterus. I had miscarried a couple months before. He wondered gently, stirring his coffee, if I might be mourning the fetus in this way. We'd been trying to have a child for years. We were running out of money, and my body and hope cycle were exhausted. How I hated the way he stirred, the carefulness of it, how it seemed to be about analyzing other people, his mind pointed on others and not himself, all captured in the pinch of his fingertips on the spoon. I was also off coffee that month to clear my system for the next round, so I was pacing around the kitchen, trying to wake myself up, flooded with envy about the existence of his mug at all. Maybe he wasn't wrong in his interpretation, but it led to a fight about the stirring that peaked with him sleeping on the sofa in the living room, which meant I could listen to my radio show in peace. Sometimes I was sure I picked fights for just that reason. He only liked to awaken to classical music, the snob, and if left to my own devices, literally, I liked to drift off as people called in to the host of this show, a tribute to an older show, now with a newer and younger and less effective host, and told, tentatively or boldly, their stories of alien encounter. I loved these people. I did not particularly believe in aliens, but something in their tremulous voices as they shared information no one had ever believed before soothed me like nothing else. I had discovered the show years ago, coincidentally, in the aftermath of my psychic blip, when I had foreseen Terry's car crash 2 days before it happened, including the deer in a dream, and when I had seen, as if in a film, my boyfriend at the time and his ex fucking in a car at Dodger Stadium. When I confronted him, he accused me of putting a camera in the car. Me who wrote letters to government officials about our data leaks. But he was wildly suspicious, especially when I mentioned the giant drink cup between them that kept poking her hip, and the sock he had come in because she didn't want to get pregnant after declaring in his ear that she was a very fertile person. She was a torturous vision from my present that would launch meanly into my future as my husband and I tried and sexed and medicaled, and I got my period over and over again, which years before had been a huge relief and now was punishment. Often I heard her breathy voice in my head as I looked upon my freshly stained underwear. I'm a very fertile person, and hated her anew. She apparently also liked car sex, she had said. It hadn't even been a dream, this vision. I had seen it all while washing dishes. It had risen up in front of my eyes while I soaped a bowl, complete with dialogue and action. The sock had been gray with a red toe. "You're a police state," my boyfriend had yelled, packing up a bag. "Where is it? Where's the goddamn camera?" He looked, of course. He scoured the car. Did he think me that level of hypocrite? We had emailed the mayor together early on in our courtship about the misuse of city funds on surveillance. We had posted on Nextdoor about the problem of everyone having cameras as their doorbells. Anyway, I had shrugged, watching him twist and turn with it all. That vision had had a particularly vivid quality to it, like it was colored in on film, and so had Terry's car crash dream, both announcing themselves as different than all the usual dreams and visions that accompanied a person throughout her life. And at the funeral, I had sat with this overly colorful image of it in my head during all the weeping and the speeches. Terry and I had been close years before, but we had fallen out of touch. She got really sporty. This was fine. I just didn't know how to relate. I did know her parents well, though. They had shared so many snacks with me, and really good ones, too. Pretzels with peanut butter, homemade shortbread. In the receiving line, I had held her mother's hands in my own and said I had a powerful feeling that she, Terry, had not suffered. "I know it's weird to say," I said. "I just feel it strongly." In the vision, it had been instant, but I didn't want to tell about the vision because was I culpable for not alerting Terry? The dream had predated the event by 1 day. The mother, whose face was puffy from weeping, thanked me. She was a kind and considerate person, one who put out the right kind of birdseed for her ecosystem. Terry had been heading to the forest to do a stint as a ranger. She had not hit the deer, but had swerved and hit a tree instead. In my vision, the deer had skittered into the woods, terrified. It would have experiences and fawns and a life bestowed by Terry and her concern. Who's to say it was the wrong choice? I mean, we say it, but we are most of us on Terry's team. The Alien show had been on the air then, too, its true form, its unaffected beauty, and that night after the funeral, I had turned it on alone in my bed, and somehow the radio was tuned to that station, and unable to sleep, fearing my dreams, I heard a caller describing the yellow-green spinning ring he had seen in the sky as a boy that no one else verified. "But I'm very clear-headed," he said. "How could I possibly make it up?" The host, always engaging, always fixing his full attention upon the caller, asked him details of the story, joking with him, riffing on the exact shade of the yellow-greenness. "You mean like lemon-lime? Sprite?" I clutched the edge of my pillow and let their voices and the general feeling they emitted fill the room. The caller's joy at being listened to, at being asked. The host's next questions. Were there any other witnesses? How terrified had he been? The caller started to cry. "You're the only one," he said, "the only one who has ever cared to know." The next day, the boyfriend of the car sex came by to collect his things. He told me he could not find the camera in the car anywhere. "I just saw it," I told him again in the doorframe, "in my mind." I seemed to be in some kind of psychic phase. He was calmer then, sadder. We had gotten along well. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not that I wanted to screw you over. I can't resist her. It's weird." She had a hold on me, too. She would lodge herself into my daydreams for the next decades. I'm a very fertile person. For some reason, I thought of the sock. "Did you throw it out?" He grimaced. "Of course. Will you see her again?" "Not on purpose." He tried to hold my hand, but I said no. "I saw Terry's death, too," I told him as we went inside to pack up his one box of extra underwear and a few books and some sneakers. "What do you mean?" We sat on the sofa at either end. I explained what I'd seen. His eyebrows rose. I told him I'd seen a similar-looking vision with him, like a dream, but with higher contrast and color. "That's why there was no camera," I said. He cried then. He said maybe I should go into business, but I said I didn't want these visions. How could I get rid of them? He suggested talking to a psychic to find out, but it didn't seem right, was negating their livelihood. When he was done crying, he looked at me heavily with wet eyes. "You're very special," he said. He was all ready to unpack his little box, but I stood, walked to the entryway. "I hope it's a phase," I said. "I feel so bad about Terry." At the door, we shared an awkward hug. "Good luck to you," he said. And on the way down the steps, he dropped the box and shattered the salt and pepper shakers he'd bought at the state fair we'd attended together, the ones in the shapes of little elfin creatures, getting shards of glass and seasoning in his clothes and shoes. And it's hard to tell a tiny shard of glass from a salt crystal. And this all felt right and true to me as markers of an ambivalent goodbye, the negation of difference between seasoning and pain. I listened to the Alien show a lot in those days as I adjusted to the grief over Terry and the loss of my relationship. I went to work, sold earrings to wealthy women who felt they needed even more variety, and returned home and ate a meal at my small kitchen table. The radio show came on at 10 p.m. and I'd be in bed, hands tucked beneath my cheek, ready for it. Sometimes the host would do a little bit on the news, pontificating in his well-enunciated, paragraph-driven showman's voice. Or he'd have a special guest on talking about the parapsychological or ghosts or even comedy. But my favorites were the nights when he would open up the lines to callers from anywhere. He'd made the container, the entertainment vessel, but what people filled it with was vulnerable and raw. The range of type of caller was wide. Some people said they were time traveling right then. A few said they were actual aliens calling. A lot phoned with little tips about eating more mollusks or cleaning with only one kind of vinegar or how to avoid any number of possible disasters. But the ones I listened for were those with stories from their past that they'd rarely or never shared that they wanted to pour for once into his willing ear. The host always flowed with what he heard, not necessarily affirming, sometimes pushing back or questioning, but always in an affable way. People wanted to tell him things. Their imaginary friend who appeared one day in the yard, grown, or the spirit who attacked their mother with a mop. One woman had seen a glorious streak of light in the sky, nearly vertical, but after checking, they had found no meteor shower listed. "Was it real?" she asked. "Was it a trick of my mind?" "Who can say," said the host. "Tell me more." An old man who had as a youth spied two gleaming pink eyes in his shed that were shaped like exact hexagons. "Almost neon," he said. "I sprayed it with Lysol." The next, a kid who thought he'd seen a spaceship, but it turned out to be a plane, but also weren't planes amazing? "Yes, they were," said the host, chuckling. "Indeed, they were." I fell asleep somewhere inside that one, and when I woke up in the middle of the night, the station was on some other show about sex tips to keep things lively, which I turned off as fast as I could. I considered visiting Terry's mom a couple times to check on her, but I thought my body and its natural aging would be a brutal affront, so I didn't go. The ex-boyfriend got together again with the fertile woman, and they dated for a while and then broke up. Sometimes I went and walked in the woods to see if I could spot a family of deer, but then the tick warnings amplified due to an unusually hot summer, and it seemed better to stay on the sidewalk. After a few months of this, I brought out my phone and put in a call to the radio show. I wasn't sure why on that day I felt like it. I just maybe had been missing the ex and his warm, calloused palms and had been thinking of Terry and how she had laughed with me, at me, with the fullness of her good nature. To be teased by Terry was the best, was personalized sunshine. A person picked up the line right away, a screener. The host had apparently just started to use screeners, who inquired about the focus of my call and asked some details of my story. My story? I had seen no magic spaceships. I considered telling the screener about a glittery oval rising from the north, but it felt like such bad faith after the show had soothed me with its sincerity night after night. So I apologized instead and told her I actually wasn't sure why I was there. Sorry, I said. I did see 2 visions, but they're not at all extraterrestrial. She exhaled. I imagined she was putting her hair up, re-barretting something. She had that kind of grooming competence in her voice. Thanks for being honest, she said. We get a lot of clowns who try to play it off. I mean, it's okay if they're clowns, but it's best if people believe what they're saying. Tonight's about actual alien sightings, and we try to keep things pretty much on theme. But I can keep you on hold as an extra in case we get dead space. No, I said, it's okay. I don't know why I called. What were the visions, she asked. I told her about the car sex, and then about Terry, about how I had not told Terry's mom, about my boyfriend's surety of a camera. And they were sort of colorful as visions, she asked. Yeah, they looked like a kid had colored in the frames, too bright for daytime, if you know what I mean. I think so. It's cool, she said, having finished her hair. You saw the future. I told her I didn't like it, didn't want it, but also that it seemed to have passed, which was a relief. Would you warn someone now, she said, if it happened again? I don't know, should I? I think so, she said. Now that you have a track record, maybe. If I were Terry's mom, I'd want to know. I'd want to know anything from beyond. I wouldn't be mad to hear it. It was weird being on the screener line. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, and I could also hear the show going on the radio on my nightstand at low volume. I was sort of there on the radio while the show was playing. I was in some kind of oral green room as an understudy. And I was also here in my bedroom on my old daisy bedspread, staring at a pile of books. Thanks, I told her. Something about it all had saddened me, but I hadn't been able to feel sad about Terry yet. I'd only felt guilty. I kept telling people we'd fallen out of touch. That was my go-to line, but that only marked the end point. Once, we had been such good friends. She had been my favorite of the friends. She had laughed about my sunburn in the shape of a hand on my neck the night before a dance and had meticulously painted it away with foundation. She had whispered to me as a countersound at sleepovers because I always had a hard time with ghost stories. She had cried into my cat's fur and let me pet her head when her father had yelled about her report card. You staying on, said the screener. No, I said, thanks, it's late. I gave her my phone number in case they ever needed to fill time, but we knew it was a popular show and that so many people were happy to be chosen. She never called. I decided after the pep talk by the screener to go see Terry's mother. She invited me in, made a sound of pained joy at the sight of me at her door. She gave me some of her famous shortbread at their extremely familiar kitchen table with the green gingham cloth napkins, now fraying at the edges. Her face was still swollen with the grief expressed and to be expressed. She asked after me, how was school, how was work, if I might have kids someday. I told her I didn't know, I had just gone through a breakup. It's worth it, she said, her eyes filling, just in case you wonder. I couldn't really bear it, so I told her even if it was just to change the subject. I said I had seen it, the crash, the night before, or 2 nights before, in a dream, a brightly colored dream, frame by frame. Her alertness increased, as if I dripped coffee into the conversational liquid. I told her the deer had been saved, that Terry had died fast, that I hadn't known if I should tell her or not because I hadn't warned Terry, and maybe I should have. No, she said, no. How did you know it would happen? How would you know it would happen? The deer? She saved the deer. So that's why she swerved? Yeah. And it was fast? It was instant. Can you describe the deer? I did the best I could, but deer do not really look all that different to me. It was brown, I said, with wet black eyes on either side of its face. She grabbed her box of tissues and cried for a while. She asked me to tell her it again. I went through it again. Then we talked about how much Terry had loved animals. It made sense, was the thing. It did supply some sense. When she walked me to the door, she pressed my hands inside hers. "Thank you," she said. "You give me something new to think about when I think of this. The old thoughts are terrible and grow on each other like mold." That night, I called the screener to tell her what had happened. I felt I owed her a big thank you since she'd been so encouraging. I'd been feeling better all day. I'd even put a barrette in my own hair as a little tribute. But the screener was a man, and when I asked for the young woman, the one with the alert and capable voice, he said she'd left the job. Left? For what? I just talked to her a week ago. I don't know. We didn't work in the same room. You're sure the one I'm describing isn't still there? There are 2 other dudes and one really slow-voiced lady and a kid. There's a kid, screener? The host's friend's son or something? Isn't it late? Kid likes to hang out. Is it the one who liked planes? Same, he said, chuckling. Do you happen to have her forwarding information? You think we just give that out on the line, he said. No, I said, no, of course not. When I hung up, I felt a surprising wave of loss in a way that was too large for the size of our relationship. But I had felt her there on the line, taking in my story like a mini version of how people probably felt with the host. Did they call many times? Did they have to turn people away for repeat visits? I myself called a couple more times just to make sure no one was lying to me. Same man picked up. You again? He said. Were you in love with her? She just gave me some good advice, I said. Well, got any UFO stories, he said, chewing on something. We have some room coming up, spaceship only, low night for calls. No, I said. It's all identified, what I've seen. No man with a balloon landed in our yard. Instead, I told my husband the whole story, all the stories. He'd heard none of it before, not about Terry and who she'd been to me, not the ex, how we'd broken up, not the screener and her quality of connecting. I had left these parts out of my past story sharing and boxed them up together and put them in the self-attic. I hadn't told him about how my visions had been prophetic twice or even of my general love of the Alien show. This may seem like a lot of things to withhold, but I guess I had wanted those things all to myself. I had not been longing to share them because, for one, it made them more actualized, but also because I liked to take them out on my own time and look at them without any shred of input from another. Marriage was about sharing on so many levels, but that didn't mean a person was ready to tell everything, to turn the bag entirely inside out. Plus, there were no timestamps on these shares. There was no requirement to get them all out by a certain moment. I hadn't been ready to talk about any of it with him until we'd been together almost 8 years, and then it was only the blue balloon dream that put those thoughts back into my own head at all. But that night, I told all of it, and my husband listened well, as he does when he's not making theories. He especially liked hearing about Terry's mother wanting to hear the dream over and over. You gave her a real gift with that, he said. We were sitting in the living room on the couch together. It was a couch again, no longer covered in bed sheets. The TV was off. The room lights were off. We kissed, and the motion sensor light went on outside, probably due to a rat or raccoon skittering along the rain gutter. We kissed for a while, and I straddled him on the couch, and we almost had sex, but then all the kid longing flooded in, and we both decided it was a good moment on its own and maybe a smart idea not to commodify it right then. So we stopped, and I rolled off, and we sat there next to each other on the couch, feeling our blood coursing. It was nice not to have a goal of any kind, not to try for a baby, not to come, not to bond, to be in the middle space for once. Maybe there'll be a man who falls into our yard, he said, who's not a metaphor at all. I rested my head on a couch pillow, and I don't know, I guess we'd go see what he needs. And if he's dead, bury him. The motion sensor light clicked on, then off again. Really? I said, closing my eyes. You would just bury some stranger in our yard? You think he'll have an ID? Why not? You think the sky birthed him? Maybe. The couch felt good. We'd had it for our first apartment. It was the first piece of furniture we'd bought together a long time ago, sitting on all the couches in the store. Can we both sleep out here tonight? I said. He made a balking noise. You think we'll fit? Sort of. Like we're in a fight with our other selves. They can sleep in there, I said, waving dismissively at the bedroom. Assholes, he said. He adjusted a pillow, stretched out. After we'd brushed our teeth, I went to get the sheets. It was a little tight, even though the couch is wide. But we adapted, moved elbows around. It seemed worth it for some reason, at least to me. We both knew without saying anything that it would only be one night. He fell asleep fast, as he always does, but before I drifted off, I tiptoed back into the bedroom and turned the radio on so that the show would play quietly to the empty marital bed. The caller had seen an orb by the moon, next to the moon, like a doubled moon. He was dragging out his sentences and sure seemed like he was making it up all on the spot, but the host didn't care. What color was the orb, the host asked in his grating voice. He wasn't nearly as good as the original host, didn't question the dangerously wacky callers enough, even in a friendly mode, and seemed out to make money on the ads in a less pure way. But I was still glad the show had continued, even in its poorer form. Blue, said the caller as I left the room. It was big and blue and glowing. I stayed in the doorframe for a moment. Did it move? Asked the host. No, it just hovered there. It looked like there was a man in it. A man? Not a real man, like the way there's a man in the moon, you know? And how did it leave? Just faded away, he said. Thank you. So I enjoy answering questions, so I welcome any that you have. Hi.
So I wrote down some phrases as you were speaking that just like popped out at me, and I want to ask you about them. So one was non-thought, one was mind space, one was dead space, one was other selves, one was self-addict, which is kind of somewhat related.
Totally related.
So I was wondering, in your writing practice or in your creation practice, what inspires you? Where do you get your mind and space and time and material? Like, what are you reading to work and kind of create these sort of partial terms that just make so much sense?
I mean, it's great to hear. You pick out those phrases, thank you. And they do feel very connected, or just this idea of how the mind works, I think is very interesting to me, or what is the process of like cognition and how does that relate to the process of writing and also processing experience and all of that. So, I mean, what do I read? I think I really am drawn to work that is, where I feel like the language is doing something that reinvents the world for me. So it's like, so poetry is great like that. I was telling someone, I have Victoria Chang's book right on my bedside table. I know she was here this year. And those poems are so beautiful. But I was also reading like Thomas Transformer, the Swedish poet who is a bit surreal. And that's kind of like anything that will sort of create an image that's new in poetry, I think for me can be very exciting, because then I'm also interested in narrative and storytelling. So then how can the language flow into a story? And I think the truth is, I just feel like one of my obsessions is the way things rattle around in my mind, and the way thought will show up what shows up on the page is often so different than what I'm thinking about in my day. And so what is that split like? How do I cultivate a space to get the writing done where I am encouraging the language to come from a place that's different than the language of, my walking around. Like sometimes I'll have a story that's really wild and people will say, oh, I wonder what it's like to be in your mind. And I'll think, it's really ordinary. It's not like I'm thinking wild thoughts at all. I'm just thinking like I'm going up the stairs, whatever, ruminating on my daily ruminations. But that I want to have that space for the imagination to flow in and then inform the work. I don't want to write about the clutter, So hopefully that kind of answers. I feel like there was maybe a hand over here. We can just hear people's psychic experiences of alien encounter.
Do you
Do I have any? I don't. Yeah, but I did listen to that show. But in LA, you just drive, like, radio is such a good companion to driving. And so sometimes I would find it on the radio when I was driving, and it was so uncanny to be driving and listening to people's stories sort of flow in. But I think I always did feel worried about suddenly becoming psychic, because I have so many, I'll just have thoughts and fears about people, and then to the fear that one of those thoughts is going to become potent. And instead to just feel like, oh, they're just thoughts. How nice. Goes back to this question of thinking and different types. Yeah. So.
You mentioned that an impetus for that story was sort of seeing other psychic stories and feeling curious of that. So I'm curious what psychic stories you
Right. I mean, that's a great question. They should be like at the forefront of my mind. I feel like there was one. Like, was there Mariana Enriquez one? There probably was, but I can't remember the title of it at the moment. It shows up a lot in fiction. So let me see if another name can bubble up. But I think it was I feel like it was just that kind of thing where I had seen enough for it to be in my mind, but it's hard to recall in the moment, sadly. Maybe something will come to me. But yes, you had one too.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if there's a parallel between being a psychic and writing the kind of fiction you write. I was just reading some of your earlier stories today, including The Motherfucker, and I think some of those ones, and I forget the title of the book, but they're so wacky. And I just think, how do you come up with that? So I'm wondering if the reason you're jealous of psychics is because you're kind of doing something like that.
Well, it feels different to sort of plow the world of the imaginative, because it doesn't project into the future at all. Like, I think that's the thing about the idea of the psychic is so fun to play with. Even though, do I believe that some people are a little psychic? I kind of do, but I don't think they're regularly psychic. I feel like sometimes people have some way, I don't know, how do they do that? But it's like ghosts, Are there ghosts? Probably. So with the writing, it feels like it's more about trying to tap into any sort of place where I can make up freely, but there's no sort of hook or line into the future at all. So there's almost something concretized in the psychic, where you have a vision, but the vision is attached to reality. And maybe that's where it feels like a really kind of, speaking of the word fertile, like a fertile fictional space to play with. But in terms of where I guess I just sort of believe that we all have this sort of, we all dream. The surrealists were like, they put a sign on the door to say the poet is working, and it was when, a poet was in the room sleeping because there was work happening, and then that's where the idea of surrealism sort of coming out of dignifying our dreams as material. And I guess I just really buy into that, where I feel like we have our lives, I have my thoughts as I walk around and do my day, and then I go to sleep, and when I remember my dreams, they're sort of an interesting conglomeration of so many things, and I'll just, like the Proustian smell memory will sort of gather things to the mind. So I guess I just feel like we're such a mishmash of imagery and feeling and memory. And so I guess my goal is to try to trick myself into accessing some of that strangeness that I think is in all of us. That feels like the area that I want to play with, Thank you. I'm glad you've been enjoying it. It sounds like Willful Creatures would be the book that one's in. Yeah. Nice to hear. Any other questions? Was there one here? Oh, yes. Thank you. Hi.
I started to blur this out, but I found you through Butterfly Lampshade, but really through your interview with Melissa Lizada.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I get quickly to whatever question that is.
That was such a meaningful interview for me. I love talking to her.
So you talked about these ruminations like saw myself.
Mm.
But how does that like when you're writing, when you go to write, does that almost, if you know, you're experiencing ruminations also as the writer, does that like extend them out, or is it almost like, I don't know, you're dancing with them and almost like accepting them, you know, like it's just a thought?
Yeah.
Does any of that make sense?
It does make sense. It's a great question. It's a deep question. So I think, now I have to wind my way to the answer, right? I think, well, okay, here's one way into it. Sometimes, particularly in undergrad classes, like someone will say, you know, they need to stay on point with their story and they need to sort of follow it through and they need to end it. And it starts to feel like the same thinking that people have around an essay. Like, I have to be consistent and I have to follow my idea. But I always feel like fiction is productive when we let the thoughts that bubble up sort of dictate where it goes. That if I'm writing along, that is merely the entry point to this sort of wacky material, right? And that if I have a kind of associative thought, often that associative thought will be richer and more interesting than the thought I begin with. So instead of staying on point, to actually veer into tangent. And that in tangent, we begin to maybe discover the material in a different way. And that material might be frightening, ruminative, scary, intrusive, all of that. But I feel like writing is a place that it does feel safe to me. And I think that's because nobody sees it. I can go anywhere in that first draft. I most likely will not like it the next day. But if there's something that is actually beginning to grow and sort of work on the page, then that's sort of the way to find it. So I think that has been, like there was a point in time when I was interested in acting and I was terrible at acting because I think it was so public. You know, that an actor has to be willing in that moment to sort of bare their soul in the immediate to the audience. It feels very brave to me in a very different way, whereas the writer is alone at the computer with a pad of paper trying things out. And interestingly, I think the stuff that has felt the scariest has often ended up landing the most, you know? That it feels like the things that I would maybe dip in for 10 minutes and then work on something else and then go back to for 10 minutes, then later would actually hold together in a different way. So the quote I sometimes like to say is this Flannery O'Connor quote, which is, your beliefs will be the light by which you see, but they will not be what you see, and they will not be a substitute for seeing. So if your beliefs, your value system, whatever sits you down as a writer, you're not going to be writing about that. You're going to be writing about something else. And the sort of light of who you are as a person will end up shaping that in some way, but it's not necessarily going to be the content. And for me, when the material feels sort of frightening in some way, horrific in some way, I'm comforted by that idea that you can go anywhere and see what comes of it. So thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah.
The first story I read of yours was, I don't know if this is the title, but it was about the ogre's wife.
Yes, the devourings, yeah.
Yes, and I really enjoyed that story. I really enjoyed how you explored this character who has a lot to feel guilty for. And how
the ogre eats the children. It is a lot to feel guilty for. Yeah. She lets it happen. The wife let in the children. Yeah. It's a classic fairy tale that, yes.
I really enjoyed that story, and it sort of got me thinking about sort of culpability and how in my everyday life I'm more inclined to want to get to the bottom of people. I want to, you want to decide, is somebody culpable? Do they feel guilty enough? If they've been punished? But in fiction, that sort of would flatten characters out because you would be allowing them to be as complex as people really are, and how complexly we see ourselves, even when we've done something or allowed something to happen.
Yeah.
And I wondered if, when you're writing,
does that come naturally, or do you ever find yourself wanting to sort of really, whittle away at a character to get to the bottom of them, and you have to sort of, I don't know, I feel like the writing is very fair. It sort of hears people out in a way, which makes the characters so much more compelling.
I mean, I think it's like, I'm glad to hear that. And I suppose it's one of the reasons why I read too, is to see the complexity in people and to think about, to be helped in thinking about that. The story that comes to mind is I was once teaching a class called The Writer in the Community, where we did writing in schools, and we got to go to a reading at juvenile hall. And the students were reading, the kids were reading their work, and my students were coming in and listening, and we read a book called True Notebooks by Mark Salzman, which is about his experience teaching in juvenile hall. It's a really moving memoir. But there was this really powerful moment where, and this is a bit of a spoiler, I do recommend True Notebooks, but I'm going to do the spoiler, where there's a character in the book who is just so wonderful, and he's in juvenile hall, he's being taught, he's doing his thing, like he's just a wonderful guy, and you just love him. He's just the most lovable character in the whole book. And then you find out 3/4 of the way through the book that he's in there for murder, and he was young, and there's all this, understanding of what's going on, but it's a shock in a certain way, right? And there was one young woman in my class who couldn't reconcile the two, who was like, how can this be the same person? And for her, it was like that was a shock. And I remember telling the story to the poet Aimee Gersler, and she said, the gray area. And it was like the perfect response from her, but it felt like it was that sense of the gray area is where I think fiction, it doesn't always live, but I think it's where I want fiction to live, because I want to think about all the strands we carry within us and the way, so that fairness feels like it's something that I really want to try for. And in this story, to up the stakes really high and have this fairy tale that I taught many times about the ogre. It's sort of like the Jack and the Beanstalk-ish tale, but in this one, the ogre's wife lets in a group of humans. The ogre's children are wearing little crowns, and the ogre's, the clever human puts the hats, the crowns on the human children in the middle of the night, and the ogre kind of comes in drunk and boozy and like eats all his own children by accident. He was going to eat the human children. It was like a fee-fi-fo-fum kind of thing. And I was always very interested in the wife. Like, what is it like for her? And, what is it like for him? And what is it like for their connection? Like, how does anyone ever possibly get past that? And so, yes, so it felt like I upped the stakes for myself about as high as I could on that one. And it was interesting to think about. Thank you. One more? Yeah, right there.
I really enjoyed the butterfly lampshade, and I was just curious as to whether you wrote it in a similar order to how it ended up being published, or if that was a different process.
Great question. And no, the way I've sort of written novels is like few scenes or chapters in an order, but really trying to follow whatever kind of scene I imagine or want to write in that moment, or just, following a sentence. And then I'll end up with a giant amount of pages and a big mess, and then I have to look and see which might come into place. But like there's close to that part I just read, there's a scene where some characters come onto the train, and that was something that in a later process I sort of realized happened at that moment, and it hadn't been clear to me until later, but the flow worked, like they fit together, so then I felt like, oh, that's there. So it's like a much different process of sort of jigsawing parts together after the work has been kind of generated. So, yeah, and then sometimes, we were talking about this in in class earlier, but sometimes the ending will pop up when you're just writing along and you think it's just a normal scene, and it actually is the end, or it's actually the beginning, and that once that's in place, the shape of the book starts to click. So like this ending took a while to figure out, but once I had the beginning, I had a certain doorway into the book. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.